My name is James Srygley. I was born October 17, 1932 in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I was raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I want to thank you both, all of you, for doing this. I think it's a great idea. My father was Os Marshall Srygley. He was born in Coal Hill, Arkansas, a coal mining area of Arkansas up in the Ozarks. His father was a lawyer and owned some stores in Coal Hill. His mother unfortunately died very close to his birth. I don't know if it was during childbirth or not. I never knew either of those grandparents. But it was very difficult for my father because he didn't have a mom. So he grew up without a mom, and he was raised by his sisters. And it affected the way he dealt with people all his life. My own mom was the daughter of a physician in Cotter, Arkansas, also in the Ozarks. She was one of 7 sisters, and he was a country doctor. He had graduated from Vanderbilt. He was one of the first, and I think he was perhaps the first medical graduate of Vanderbilt University, and he went to the Ozarks to practice medicine, but somehow he decided not to continue after a period, and he went into stores, and eventually they moved to Little Rock. And I did know both my grandparents on my mother's side. So my mom had 6 children, my mom and dad, and we lived in Little Rock. My oldest sister was Lucille, a wonderful woman. She's now dead. And then Uncle Buddy, Fletcher Wallace, was the next one. And then Wilhelmina, and then Eddie, and then myself, and then my little sister Ann. So we were all born in Little Rock and lived there for much of our lives. My father was not a warm person. He loved us and he worked hard. He looked at his responsibility as being to provide for that family. And you have to remember that this was during the Great Depression. I was born in 32 and the Depression was still going on. And with 6 children, and although he had gone to some sort of a business school, times were hard for him, and he worked very, very hard. He was a good person at finding things to do. He, in addition to his regular job, which was a price auditing work at a large drug company and drug distribution company in Little Rock, he had the idea that because he knew the prices of all of these drugs that are supplied to drugstores, he put crews together and they would go out and they would do the annual inventories of drugstores, because a drugstore doesn't know what it sold until it does the inventory from this year versus the inventory last year. So it really can't judge exactly how, they didn't have computers in those days, so they would do a manual inventory. And my father would go out with a crew, and they would list all of the drugs that were in the drugstore as of a certain date. It would take about 3 days to do that. They would come on long lists of the drugs. And my father knew the prices of all these drugs in his head. He would just blink about. And then he would give that first to my sister, my oldest sister. That was her job at first. And then later, when she got married, I took it on, and I would add them all up with a comptometer. And I often thought, man, I wonder how accurate I am. And I would sometimes go through and recheck a page, and they might be off, but they were never off more than pennies. So I knew that it really wasn't that critical, because these were individual items. Can you imagine? There were thousands of them. So I would have to make a pretty big error to really affect the results. And we never did get any complaints. But it was a lot of work, tremendous amount of work, and he did it simply to have enough money to keep the family going. My mom was a very, very good mother. She was overwhelmed with the 6 children, and my father didn't really talk to us. He didn't really discipline us. He didn't do anything but try and provide for us. And it wasn't the kind of family where you would have long talks with your father. No one did. Certainly I did. But my mom was a very, very warm person, and she raised us to the best of her ability. Eddie was, of course, my closest brother, and there was a girl who lived near us named Velma, and she she kind of liked me, and that was when we had moved to Wolf Street, and she was a nice enough person, but when I was young, I didn't have any interest in that, and Eddie was always teasing me about her, and he would say, "Jim loves Velma," and I said, I don't even know her. So then he would start to call me Velma, and I really did irritate. Anything to irritate. The kids were really great kids, and it was a good family. But you know how kids are. They imposed the discipline in our family. If a child got out of line, then the other 5 would sort of make them toe the line. My mom did what she could, but with 6 kids, it was tough, very tough. Anyway, those were the names that I remember that I just couldn't stand. Velma. In those days, we were spanked, and we would receive spankings, and she had no options to that. I mean, that was the way things were done. And she was very, very good, though, very fair. I remember, I've told you once before, I think we moved to 2900 Wolf, and right next to us was this huge field. It was about 10 acres. And we had a cow, and my job was to take the cow out into the field in the afternoon, or in the morning, and bring the cow back in the afternoon. Anyway, we would play in that field. It was a great field to play in, just abandoned. It was owned by someone, but we never knew who. And I used to go out there and play fireman, and I would take some papers and set them on fire and then put them out. And one day I did that. I must have been about 7. I couldn't get it out, and the whole field started to burn. And, there were a lot of trees there, so they didn't burn, but all the brush and things caught fire. And, of course, the fire department came, and fortunately, the fire chief of that station was a member of our church, and he was always really good to me, and so he didn't make anything big out of it, although he had to put it out. And then, of course, after it was all over, you can imagine how all the other kids in my family, they were going to get me, Mom, who set that thing, that was Jimmy, he said it. And I did say it, but Mom, she said, no, that's it. No more talk. I would say the biggest mistake, I remember a huge mistake, and it relates to school. School was always very easy for me in the sense that I could get grades without doing any work. I learned that I could take tests very, very well. Right. And so I would just cram for tests and, get grades. And that was a big mistake because I didn't learn as much as I should have learned when I was growing up. I could have done better. And in those days, there wasn't any money around. There wasn't such a thing as a scholarship on need. There were very, very few scholarships, and you had to, really be outstanding to get a scholarship, or else your parents had to have money, and ours didn't. So I really missed out on that because it was like my view of Clinton. He never really got caught when he was very young. He could get away with things, and he did. And so did I. I got all the way through college, almost into my senior year of college. I operated that way, and it was a really big mistake, and I really do regret that. I didn't benefit from the experience enough. I could have studied. I could have done my homework. My big thing was I didn't take books home, and I didn't do my homework. And see, my parents didn't have, no one in my family had a university background, so they didn't really. They trusted me. Since I was getting the grades, they trusted that, I was doing what I had to do. And I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't doing my homework. I wasn't bringing it home. And so I could have benefited a lot more from that experience. I could perhaps have gotten scholarships that I didn't get because they were very difficult to get. So I really regretted that. I think that now where people are are more involved with their children, what they're doing in school. Bonnie's tremendously involved. I think that's extremely good. It's very, very good because kids will take the easy way out. The one thing I remember that my family regarded me as being a bit different because we didn't have money. The kids, we all had jobs. We all had to get, we didn't get any allowance or anything. There wasn't anything to go around. So we all did work. But when I was young, so young I couldn't even work, still, my brothers and sisters were very generous, and they would say, well, we're going to buy a piece of candy for each kid. So each kid gets a nickel to buy a piece of candy. And, you know, we were just over. But I would always say, can I just keep the nickel? And they, to this day, really teased me about that. But I always thought, well, if I could just keep that money, I would be better. I would forego the candy. So I think that was a thing they noticed that at a very early age it was different. Before we moved to Wolf Street, we lived at 310 Beach. That's where I was born. And we moved there. We moved from there when I was 4 to 2900 Wolf. And because we didn't have much money, my mom would cook and sell the baked goods, you know, to help the family. And I remember those cinnamon roll smells where they were going out the door, you know, that we weren't getting them. And I, you know, I was young, but still I remember that very well. Wow. And we all, you know, we knew that that was part of what had to be done. So, and it wasn't that we were any different from other people. I mean, the whole environment was in that sort of economic situation. It was the Depression and a family with 6 children and just an ordinary job. That's what people had to do to get by. All the jobs I had, they never asked me to give them money. They never did. But if I needed money, that's how I got it. I didn't have a bike until I was about 19, and I had saved enough money to buy one. And that's the way it worked. I think when I was about 12, I worked in a grocery store, you know, delivering groceries. And when I was in junior high school, I worked in delivering drugstore orders. And of course, I worked on newspaper routes and things like that. And one Christmas when I was about 10, I guess, I had always wanted a bow and arrow. Always wanted it. And we would make bows, you know, and they were lousy. You know, you'd take a stick and try and bend it and put a string around it, and you could shoot about 10 feet. That would be about it. But there was in Arkansas a company called the Ben Pearson Company, and they made bows. They made bows for the whole United States. They were a big bow maker, and I just wanted so much to have a little bow that they would make. And of course, we didn't have the money. And also, my mom was a little worried about me shooting somebody with it. But one Christmas, there it was, that bow, and it was the best Christmas I ever had. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. We never went to camp. The only camp I ever went to was a boys' club camp that my mom finally agreed that I could go to. But instead of that, we would sometimes go to Winchester in the summertime, where Uncle Paul and my sister lived. And in Winchester, there was a completely different environment. It was farming area. And when we would go down there, as I was a young boy, I would work in the store there, help out in the store. They had a general store. My Uncle Paul owned a general store. And I would help sell things there in the general store. But in the evening, we would play baseball. They would have a baseball team in Winchester, and we would go out and play baseball. And it was a really good time. We would usually go down for maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I don't remember that Uncle Eddie went down, because when I was going down, it was before I was working in the summertime. So I was about 10 or 11. But once we started to work in the summers, and that was both summers, and we didn't have time to go down. But I do remember Winchester with a great deal of pleasure. It was later in life, I would go back for visits. and they were always very, very nice down there. Grade school was near, in Little Rock, near 2900 Wolf. It was James Mitchell grade school, grammar school. And once again, it was very easy and to get grades. And I read all the time. And so that was something that appealed to the teachers in grade school, that someone had read. Well, they did. But that was really a big problem for me. It meant that I didn't step up and do what I had to do to get where I should get. But I did read a lot, and the teachers just thought that was just great. And I noticed that Jillian reads a tremendous amount. I think it's very, very good for her. And I guess all the grandchildren read a lot. You all read a lot. I think that reading is a wonderful thing. I first liked mythology, and later I just liked any kind of story. You have to remember, we didn't have television, we didn't go to the movies. We just had a few books in the house. So I read everything that was in the house. And my mom, who had been a school teacher, had some pretty good literature in the house, so I read all that, and I liked it. And I would go to the library. You could go to the library on a bus, take a bus and go down. And as Mom says, your mom says, he never turned all the books back, and it's true. After Mom and I were married, and we came back to Little Rock, and she found some books that still had due dates for the Little Rock Public Libraries, and we turned them all in. It was like one of those Seinfeld episodes, but they didn't put me in jail. But I used the library a lot. We didn't have the kind of dental care that we would have today, that our children and grandchildren would have. And as a result, and I really hated, there was a dentist that I just could not stand, Dr. Adams, and he was not a painless dentist, he was a painful dentist, and he started specialized in that. He had no rapport with children, and he just scared the britches out of me at a very early age. And I think at that time he was just examining my teeth. Anyway, I just couldn't stand that person. And so I would use every excuse possible to not go to him, not go to the dentist. And of course, in our family with 6 children, and Mom being so overwhelmed with all the, I mean, she wasn't going to check every one of your teeth and make sure you went to the dentist. And we didn't have the money for that. So as a result, my teeth got in really bad shape. And when I was in high school, they were nearly all pulled. And that was a pretty bad experience for me. It took a long time before I had any teeth. And so in high school, yeah. And I remember the teacher would say, well, Jim doesn't have to talk today. I wasn't really able to talk. But the kids were, it's funny, the kids didn't, they didn't make, the big deal out of it. But it's just a fact. It was just, he hadn't got any teeth. But it was better than before when I did have teeth, but they were really bad. So I would say it was all positive, but it just came to a crashing halt when they had to pull them. I think they pulled 18. Wow. And then later they had dentures, and so that worked out. But it was traumatic. Didn't do much for your dating life, I'll tell you. But in those ages, I didn't think about dating. I was a junior, I guess, in high school when that happened. Everyone was oriented towards going into work so they could make some money and improve their lives. But I really always thought, well, I would want to go to college. I certainly knew I wanted to go. But because I hadn't really worked hard enough to get scholarships, I didn't know if I could go, where I could go, and how I could go. So I went to a junior college there in Little Rock. We didn't have enough money to go anywhere else. And it later became Little Rock University, but at that time it was called Little Rock Junior College. I went there for 2 years. And once again, I was able to do well without really working. I worked as a soda jerk when I was there, and I also worked as a usher in a movie theater, then Little Arkansas Theater, downtown Little Rock. And a funny thing happened there. I was always interested in magic, trying to learn how to do things. And one day, because I worked at taking the tickets, some guy showed up. And man, he was able to do tremendous handwork, prestidigitation. Very, very good. And I thought, well, this guy's really good. And he said, well, who's the manager here? And I said, well, Thad. He was my boss. He said, Thad, oh yeah. And so he went away. And then later I learned that he had gone in and he said he hadn't bought a ticket. He had gone to the inside, and he said, is Tad here? And they said, yeah, he's down inside. He'd gone on in, he hadn't paid. So this guy was not only good with his hands, but he was a tricky guy. But it wasn't unusual. All the kids that I knew worked to make money.
Right.
But then when I finished at Little Rock Junior High, the question was, what are you going to do now? And we didn't have the money to go to university. So I had gotten, because once again I had good grades, and I had gotten a scholarship to the University of Toronto. They said, if you'll come up here, we'll pay your studies, we'll pay for your studies, and there probably would be a way to work. So Paul Searcy, who was a friend of mine, he and I hitchhiked to Toronto. And when we got up there, I worked in the Y at the telephone reception of the Y to make enough money to live, and I had a room at the Y. But it became apparent I couldn't afford to. I mean, that didn't pay me enough to keep living and to go to, even though the school was free. So at the end of the summer, Ben and I had to come back. We couldn't afford to go there. And since it was so hard to get rides, we split up. And, up there we learned that in Canada, it was not unusual for someone who wasn't able to find a place to sleep to sleep in a jail. They would not, and so I did that in the United States. I did it in Canada coming back in Hamilton, but then finally when I got into the United States, somewhere in Tennessee, I went into, and they said, okay, we'll put you up. But we had to lock you in. And they did. And I remember that experience very well. It was in, I think, Kingsport, Tennessee. And the next day they let me out, and that was fine, but it was different. But coming back, I had learned that Texas A&M was regarded as a school where you could go and take a loan, and that they would loan enough money so that you could go. I mean, they recognized needy students. It wasn't a scholarship at first, but it was. And Paul got an NROTC scholarship. He had to sign up to become a naval officer, and they sent him to school. So we both were able to go without money. It was a military school. You had to take ROTC. You were signed up. So I went through that, but I was 2 years out. You see, the ROTC is a 4-year program.
Right.
So I had taken none. So when I got to be actually as a junior, just before my senior year, they had a program where I could accelerate my training, so I would be commissioned when I left Texas A&M. But that meant I would have to could go to summer camps, and I just couldn't afford that. We had them at work. I mean, you had to do something.
If you're in summer camp, you're not working.
That's right. I mean, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for all that? And so I didn't take it. And so when I got my degree in chemical engineering, and I went to work and had enough money, I was exposed to the draft, because the draft was on then. This is the Korean War. And so I went to work as an engineer for UOP in Chicago, terrific company. That's when I learned the importance of study, in my senior year. And the reason I learned it is that when these companies came down to interview, they wanted to see what your grade point ratio was. And, mine was okay. It was good, but it wasn't what it should have been if I'd worked. And the guys I'd worked, been students with all this time, I mean, I knew what they could do and I knew what I could do. And they had higher grade point ratios, some of them did, because they had worked harder. And they got better jobs. The way UOP worked is you came in first and you worked in their research development labs, and then they sent you out on the road, which is later how I met Mom. They sent you out on the road as an engineer, starting up refineries or the processes that were developed there at UOP. And when I got in there, of course, I really couldn't go out until I got my military service obligation off. So I was doing some research, and UOP said, look, we can get you a deferment. We can get you a deferment. I said, yeah, but what happens then? I said, well, you got to go. I mean, unless the draft, yeah, it was just deferring the going to the draft. I said, no, I'm going to go ahead and do it. So I went and I was drafted and went back to Arkansas because that's where the draft board was. And they sent me to Fort Smith for basic training, and I really was astounded when I got up there because I may have mentioned to you that the first day you were in the mess hall and this guy next to me was eating his eggs with his hands. I mean, it was... You have to remember, I'd gone to a military school, so I had gone through all of that many, many times, and as a result, they felt this was someone they could give some responsibility to because he wasn't just a ordinary recruit. So I did receive, some recognition, and got out of some KP duties that I perhaps otherwise would have gotten just in the normal rotation.
What was your rank when you were?
Well, you're nothing. You're a private. You're drafted, but still, having knowledge in advance of how to do those things helped me, and probably I had an easier time of it than otherwise would have had. I was able to get what's called I can't remember, what is it, marksman's badge, the highest, sharpshooter badge. And as a result, I had dinner with the...
So you were a good shot.
Yeah, well, I had...
You're a sharpshooter.
Yeah, I had good eyes then. And I had dinner with the company commander and his wife, and I was offered to go to, officer training. Of course, I could have done that, but you had to sign up for one more year. You had to do 3 years instead of 2. You're drafted for 2 years, and I didn't want any part of that, so I didn't go. I refused it. And after that, I was sent to Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis, and there it was called the Adjutant General School, and it was mainly college graduates who were sent to that training. But there you learn all of the skills to be a secretary to a general officer, and that's what I became after that. After the school, I had to go to the port of debarkation. It was in Seattle. There I went by train, and there they do a filtering of the people, because these people were all going to Korea. The war was still on, and it wasn't terrible combat. It was winding down by that time. This was in 1955, right at the January of 55. But still, there was a war, and all of the troops, all of the draftees were going to Korea. And there was a rule in the Army that if anyone went to Korea, if they got to Korea, they had to stay there until their tour was up. And the reason was, everybody got to Korea, they started to finagle to get out of Korea and go to Japan. So it was extremely important that when I went through Seattle, that they didn't send me to Korea. And they didn't. They sent me to the Army headquarters for the Far East in Yokohama. It was Camp Zama. It's near Yokohama. And I became secretary to General Walker.
How did you feel about the military in general, your experience?
Well, it's set up in such a way that they can take just about anybody in and turn them into a soldier, just about anybody. And it has to be that way. But it's not a situation where they can cut a lot of exceptions. They have to, it's like a cookie cutter factory, and that's how it works. But it does work well, and you get fit. I mean, you work hard. You're physically fit. It's not an intellectual challenge by any means, but it's a physical challenge. And I really admire those people. I think the people who do the training are dedicated people, I didn't see combat because when I went to Japan, there wasn't any combat in Japan, and also the war had pretty well, the armistice had pretty well been sort of negotiated by the time I got to Japan. I got to Japan, I think, in March of '55, and it was all over by then. Well, in UOP, when I went to work for them in Texas, or as a graduate engineer, they described what the program was. You would go into research for a period of time until you learned their processes, the processes that they had developed. And then you, as an engineer, would go on the road and would start up refineries using those processes. That was what you did. So I knew I was going to do that. That was what I accepted when I accepted the job. The ones I was working on in those days were converting naphtha, which is a low form of gasoline, into high-octane gasoline so that they could be used in cars and aviation, whatever. So it was very, very vital to a refinery. So they treated us accordingly, because if you messed it up, delayed the startup, caused it to be a problem, then that refinery couldn't produce high-octane gasoline for a period of time until you got it right. So it was really quite a responsible job. Well, they wouldn't send you overseas until you'd gone through several of these startup refineries and processes, and I did 3 or 4 in the United States, and then they sent me over because we had these teams all over the world, and they had a SIBP where Mom worked, had constructed this particular process unit that UOP had designed, and when I went over with our team to start it up, I asked if there was any possibility of playing tennis. And she said, well, there is a club here at SIVP, and I know a friend who might be willing to introduce you to the club. And so that's how it happened. She made the arrangements, contacted Mom, and Mom and Aunt Therese came to our apartment to take me to the tennis place. And unfortunately, I'd been working all night, and because I was on midnight shift, and I had slept through. And so when she got there, that guy the engineer I was living with, said, "Come on in." And they said, "We're not coming in," and so they left. But then he woke me up and said, they were here. And I said, "Oh my God, I wasn't awake." And so I took a taxi I followed a taxi. I asked a taxi to go to that club, and I would follow it in my little Volkswagen. And that's how I met her. And Papa was there, and Mom, and one other person. Jean, her brother.
How do they like your tennis style?
Well, they didn't like my pants very much. I had these Bermuda shorts on that were not a big success in Belgium. And then later, I have to tell you this, later, after I played that time, then later I played another time there and was invited home to eat lunch with them. And Jean was going to stay with me until I changed and came home. Mm-hmm. And so he did that. We walked to their house. And later I learned that Jean said, he has shorts on that have flowers on it. He's got, in those days we wore boxer shorts. In America we wore boxer shorts. And in Europe they wear these little briefs, the white briefs. But the Jean had told them all, this guy's got shorts with flowers on it. But anyway, later I got to know Mom a little bit. And then I was sent from that refinery to Germany. So I was working in Germany and was corresponding with Mom, and I'd come back and would see her. And that's how I got to know Mom, by coming back. I'd have to drive back. They did this for any number of people. They would bring them home for dinner. I mean, a lot of priests would come in from Latin America, where Fenal was a priest. They would come in and be treated to a meal, and I don't know if they were ever put up or not, but it was very, very common to have a meal with people from the outside, so I just get into that pattern. Well, I had asked Mom out for dinner a couple of times, and then we got to know each other a little bit better, and so I just thought, I liked her a lot, and I just thought that was what I wanted to do. So I asked her, and she was astounded. It was in a kilt club, I think, where we were. This was a little club that you went to. It was a little private club because in Belgium they had these liquor laws where after a certain time liquor couldn't be served. So they had these clubs where you would put a bottle in the club and they would keep it for you. And then you could go there after hours and you could either drink your bottle or just sit there and talk. So that's where it was. And then she didn't give me any kind of an answer, but we corresponded, and finally she wrote me a letter. Of course, she wrote it in French, and I wasn't too sure of my French in those days because I really hadn't started learning French. So I had to have him help me with Mom's letter. And he was reading along. He said, "What? You proposed?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well." And then he kept reading. "What?" She says, "Maybe yes." It was kind of funny. But Mom was not keen because I wasn't Catholic.
Oh.
She wasn't too keen on the whole process.
Interesting.
But she was, she was friendly. In the meantime, she was contacting through Catholic authorities, Catholics in Little Rock to find out if there was anything, was this a serial killer or not. And I almost blew it in Elstenkirk, and I have to tell you about this. I was staying in this little hotel, and Mom and her parents were staying in this great big hotel. It's been torn down since. It was a huge hotel. And it had all wooden floors. And it was like a pension where families stay and they eat at a big table. Each family eats at its own table. Or it's a large table, but maybe at this end of the table, one family, at that end of the table, another family. So I was there and eating breakfast, really enjoying it. And, in Little Rock, we always had confiture jelly with our meals, with our breakfast. And there wasn't any, so I saw it on the table and I took it. And it belonged to another family. And everybody just went, "What is this? This guy is taking their jelly." And Mom had to explain to people that's the way it was in America, that people expected to have that. And if it wasn't there, but it was on the table, they assumed it was for them. It was really funny. In the meantime, I was sent to Italy. And there I was working in Italy, in Gaeta. And I had to come back from Italy for the wedding. I came up from Gaeta and we were married, and Mom and I went back to Italy and we had our honeymoon. We actually went to Capri on our honeymoon, even though I could only take off a few days, because when we worked in a refinery, there were usually only 3 of us, because the company, whoever was receiving us, had to pay a tremendous amount of money for us, so by person. So we would, if possible, they would want to have 3 rather than 4. Well, that meant that you had to work every day, to cover the shift, the 24 hours, or else 2 people had to work 12-hour shifts while 1 person was off. So you would rotate that way, and that's what we did, so I could go down to Capri. And then after that, we had a series of other assignments, and then I went back to Germany, and Mom was with me, and then Kathy was about to be born, so Mom went back to Antwerp to have Kathy. And while I was working in Germany, a different refinery, those guys worked 12-hour shifts for me so I could come back for Kathy. And, you know, that was really good of them. People were really good people that I worked with. Of course, I paid them back, yeah, when I had a chance. And then after that, after Germany, we were sent to the Canary Islands. And that was really a plush assignment. I'll explain to you why. It was a process that had been already installed and started up some years before by UOP, but it had gotten into trouble. And the trouble that these processes get into, because they are using a catalyst that's made of platinum, terribly expensive, millions of dollars involved. And when the process goes bad, it kills the platinum, it kills the catalyst. And it had happened down there. And so the client, which was a Spanish oil company, wanted someone, this had happened by their people. After they'd been trained, they killed it. And they wanted someone to come in, an engineer to come in and be with it through the entire life of the catalyst, the next catalyst. And so they sent me down there, and that was really a nice assignment because we stretched the life of that catalyst out so long. Mama and I were down there. Well, I was down there from I guess I got down there in about February of 1960, right after Kathy's birth. I went down, and then when Mom was able to come down, she came on down until September of '61, when I went back to graduate school. So we got a year. I got a year, almost a year and a half out of that catalyst, and they were very, very happy because that was money in the bank for them, and we were happy because I just had to go out to the refinery every day and make sure they didn't do anything stupid. Kathy was about 8 months old. Of course, Louis was coming in November of that year. And Kathy was very close to the maid. I mean, the maid helped her a lot. Kathy was a very, very bright child. Then Louis was born, and there was a lot of trouble. Louis was a little bit early, so it was not easy. And the medical conditions were not great down there. We had the best doctor they had, but Louis was born in this guy's clinic. And so it was not an easy time. And then later, Louis had to have a small procedure right after his birth. And they didn't give him any anesthesia or anything. They just gave him, I think, whiskey, Lou. But I was already impressed with how strong Louis was. He must have had Mom's threshold of pain ability. So after a period, though, the letters came through accepting me at Texas A&M into the graduate program. And we left in September on a boat from the Canary Islands, and you went from there back up to Antwerp, and then from Antwerp we took a boat from Rotterdam over to the United States. That was terribly difficult for Mom because the trip up to Antwerp from the Canary Islands was rough. You go through the Gulf of Biscayne, which is a notoriously rough water. Mom was sick going up. We had the 2 kids, and she was sick. We got into Antwerp. The family was there to greet us, both mine and both and both great time there. And then we went from there to Rotterdam, and Jean saved us because I had to get all of the papers for Mom to be able to enter the United States. Visa, because she still wasn't a U.S. citizen, X-rays, all kinds of work. And unfortunately, when we headed out to Rotterdam, we left some of that on the table. And when we got to Rotterdam, we were on the boat, but if you don't have those papers, you cannot leave. And Jean saw those papers, and he got in the car, and he drove like a bandit. And I'm not even sure he was able to drive, but he got there. And he got there in time, and boy, did we love him. I will never forget what he did. It is fantastic. So Mom and I on the boat with the kids. Mom was sick on the boat coming over. We actually came in, I'm pretty sure we came into Hoboken. I think the boat dropped in Hoboken then. And it was hot, and we had all of our goods, and we had the Opel coming off. And so we weren't the first people to leave the pier. We had to wait a long time, and the kids were, Louis was walking around by then. He was, and Kathy was running around by then. So we were there on the pier in the heat, and then we finally got off and got to a hotel in New York. And then the next day, I had to get the Opel. Yeah, I had to check it through customs and get all of that and drive it to Arkansas and on back to Texas A&M. So Mom flew with the kids from New York to Little Rock. She had never met my parents, and she wasn't feeling good because of the trip, and also she wasn't feeling good because of the airplane. And they met her and they loved her immediately, of course. My whole family did. And then I drove the Opel from New York through Chicago because I'm still working for UOP. I was on leave of absence to go to Texas A&M. I mean, you wanted to hold those options open. They didn't pay me any money, but they did come down once in a while and give us a dinner. When they were down recruiting, they would look me up. And so we showed up at Texas A&M, and when we got there, where are you going to live? The project housing. They had these houses for graduate students that you would live in. They were very cheap. My scholarships would really cover things like that. And of course, I had saved as much money as I could. I had saved money. So we did have money, but we didn't want to use it unless we had to. And the one thing I remember in those project housing, project housing was, of course, it was right next to the train. And the train would come through every morning at 6. And the first probably 3 nights we heard it. Then we didn't hear it anymore. But what we did hear was Louis, because he had an earache problem, and we didn't know what it was until we got that straightened out. It was, unfortunately, Louis was in a lot of pain. Finally got that straightened out. And of course, I don't know if you understand the way graduate school is, but it is time consuming. I just had to throw myself into that. And by doing that, I got, after that, I got a complete fellowship, a NASA fellowship awarded by NASA, which really increased our standard of living a lot. And we were able to move into Nagel Street, where Mark was born. And there we were able to afford to live in the house, not just the project housing. Well, when I got my PhD, UOP wanted me to come back and work for them, but I didn't really think they had enough to offer. And a man named Carol Clater had gone to work. He had gone to work with Air Products. He was a manager at Air Products, a senior manager, but he had gotten his master's degree at Texas A&M, and he knew the professors at Texas A&M, and they had told him about me, and he came and he specifically wanted me to work for him. In those days, an engineer, a PhD engineer, had lots of job offers. I had lots and lots of job offers, and so we could have gone anywhere. We could have gone to Exxon. We could have gone to anybody, but I thought, this man knows people that I know, and so I went to work for them in Air Products, and he was my boss, Carol Clater, and he was very, very helpful to me in my career. His department was the computer systems department. That's because I had done my research using the computer, and that's what they wanted. They wanted someone to use the computer in process engineering work. And that's what I did. I was manager of process systems for UOP. But it struck me that this was not a big enough area to stay in forever. The computer area, I wasn't working for a computer company. I was working for an engineering company, Air Products, an engineering company. We were using the computer, but that was too narrow a niche. So I wanted to get into something that was more in the mainstream, or else it was a much bigger activity of that sort. And Mobile was trying to find someone at that time to use their computer systems overseas. Mobile had a tremendous computer system development in America, but not overseas. It was mainly commercial. They didn't have any technical computing. So they wanted someone that would help develop and help overseas people use computers in a way that made more sense technically. And I fit right in because I'd worked overseas. I, had that background. I could speak French, and they hired me for that. But after I got there, I figured out this is still a niche. It's really a niche that's not the main business. And things went well, but it wasn't the main business. When we moved to to New Providence, and we knew you were coming, Christian came over, and Christian stayed in our house there at Pineway while Mom had you. And then we were all really happy. We were all together, all four of us there in New Providence. And I think it was a happy family. The one problem there was when it rained, the whole backyard was about a foot deep. You remember at Pineway, you were too young. You would have drowned if you'd been out. But it was pretty deep. The kids loved it. They were out chomping in there. Of course, Mark had his problems with that dog across the street. When Jim Reardon, the president of Mobile International, decided that he wanted to see if I could make it in the oil business rather than the computer business, and he created this assignment in London, then we had to move. That was in February of '72, and we packed up. Mom sold our Plymouth station wagon at a garage sale. We even sold the stuff that Louis and Mark had gotten out of the dump, that the toys and everything that they'd been down at the dump getting. We sold those in our garage, so we sold everything. And we sold the house. And the woman who helped us sell the house was Mary Moravi, so that's how we knew her so well. But when we got to London, we didn't have a place to live. And we had a lot of trouble finding a place. Because in London, in England in those days, they had this thing called gazumping. You'd buy a place, you thought you had it. But in England, until way down the road, no one was bound. Until all of the issues involving the deed and everything, no one was, and that means price wasn't bound. So if price was moving in the meantime, if price was moving up, the seller might decide, well, I don't want to be bound. There's no contract until the absolute last moment. That's the craziest system I've known. The Scottish system is like our system. You agree on price. There may be some other things you don't agree on, but you're still agreed on price. In England, you're not agreed on anything until the contracts, they call it contract exchange, and that is the closing. Until the closing, nothing's agreed. So if the price is moving in the meantime, and they were in those days, the prices were moving up, we got gazumped. We bought this really nice place down in Walton-on-Thames. We had it. We paid full price, and we didn't get it till the guy almost doubled the price later, as we, because it was moving up at all this time, and it took months. So finally, we bought this Melbury Court where you all lived. Got this apartment, and it was a lease, but we bought the lease. The lease had so many years to run, and we had to pay money to buy the lease. And then the issue was, when we left, how many more years did it have to run? So could we get any money back for our leasehold? It's a complicated system that is not terribly good. But that's what happened. And so we were there in London, living together. You went to Bassett House. Mark went to Ripley with Ripley House with Louis, and Kathy went to Princess Helena. And the reason we had to send you to boarding school was we didn't know where we were going to live. We were floating around trying to get a place to live. And then later, we were in London, and then later an opening occurred in Paris under Paul Mostini, the president. And I went over to interview him, and he didn't like me. I refused to speak French to him because I didn't want him taking me because I spoke French. I wanted him taking me because, and that was a really big mistake, because Paul thought, he had heard I spoke French, and he thought I was somehow putting him down by not speaking French to him. But we got that all straightened out, and then he became the best boss I ever had. And then later in Paris, working there, we had a lot of trouble because the oil embargo occurred. Then the Saudis embargoed the oil to the United States, and several of the Arab countries stopped the shipments in '73 to Holland and to other countries. But France had this special relationship with the Arabs, and they wanted to get the oil. But Mobil had to apply it to everybody because we had to supply everybody. We couldn't give France their oil and not give it to Holland and not give it to Belgium, not give it to these other countries. So, and I was head of supply there, so I had to deal with the French government, and we got into really serious arguments with the government. And Raleigh Warner, the chairman of Mobil, came over to help in the discussions, and I briefed him and worked on that with him. And then he decided that I ought to come to New York because he wanted to see what I could do. So from Paris, we had to come back. Every chief executive, every super executive of Mobil has gone through planning. It's the guts of the oil business. The investments are so large that you have to plan those capital investments. And then planning also handles operational questions that require approval at a higher level. It all comes up through planning. And then I was in planning in New York, in corporate planning, the main overall planning for Mobil. And then they decided they would try me out in a line job, and I would become president of Mobil BV. And of course, that was another assignment that took us right back to Holland. And they moved there for 3 years. And one of the interesting things about that is that as president, when I came in, the Mobil people filled up the heating oil tank and overflowed it. We had heating oil all over the driveway. I would like just to say a few things about each child, not to describe the children, but to describe some of the things that come to mind, starting with Kathy. When we got to the Canary Islands, it was a tough time. Mom had Louis coming, and we had our maid there, Rosa was her name, Rosa. And the one thing I remember about Rosa and others talking about Kathy is they all said, ella es lista. Lista means she's ready. She was very advanced. Kathy was a very advanced child. And the thing I remember most is that, she was our first child and our only child at that time. Mom and I would take her into our bed sometimes, and I would be dozing, and I'd feel this finger in my ear. Kathy was trying to figure out what an ear was, and she was putting her finger in my ear. It was something else to wake up with someone with their finger in your ear. But she was just curious, a curious child. Later with Kathy, I remember particularly teaching her to drive, and also I remember taking her to find a school, and we went to several schools, and then we went to Swarthmore and talking to them. And Kathy had good grades, and she was a National Merit finalist, so they took her in. And I remember with Kathy helping to write the essay that is so important in getting into a school like that. So those are memories I have of Kathy, particularly together when we were traveling around and looking at schools, and it was good. Then with Louis, that boy, I remember some really good things about Louis, but one of the things that I remember most was after we had gone, when we were working at Air Products in Allentown, we decided to take our first vacation together as a family. And we went to the White River in Arkansas to fish. And I really think it was a terrific thing. We hadn't done that before, but it was fun, and I think everyone enjoyed it. But after that, one evening, I remember Louis in this little cabin where we were. I just looked in on Louis and Mark, and Louis was, I think, dozing. He was sleeping. But in his sleep, he did this. He threw this rod out, and he went, he was reliving fishing. I thought that was just terrific. Another thing I remember about Louis is that he's very stoic. Louis has a high threshold of pain. Louis had a stomach ache, and so I was worried about it, and Louis never complained about pain, so I knew it was serious. He and I went to the ER at Overlook, and this intern decided it wasn't anything. I mean, a really big mistake. It wasn't appendicitis, but the intern didn't spot it. And evidently, in medicine, if you can't spot that, then you're really not doing your job, if you can't spot an appendicitis. Louis came home, the pain continued, and so I knew it was very serious. And he was taken in, and it wasn't appendicitis, and it could have been threatening. So those are things I remember. Louis' ability to withstand pain, and he didn't complain. He never complained. He was with Bobama and Bopapa in Belgium, and they were on some kind of a big bag swing or something that broke. He almost broke his leg. He didn't complain. Bopapa came to me and said, "This boy doesn't complain. You know, he really hurt himself." And I said, "I know where he gets that. It's from his mom, not from me." I remember those things about Lulu. And then Mark, of course, we all remember the events he had with the cat down in Bryan. And the cat was pretty vicious. We didn't seem to be able to do too much with the cat until the policeman said, "Well, I know what I'd do. I'd shoot it." But one thing I wanted to tell you about Mark that I forgot, I've never mentioned, I don't think, and it really bothered Mom and me. When we were living in Allentown, Mark had the need of a small procedure. It was like a hernia, and he was only 4, going on 5. And for some reason, I can't imagine why we did this, why we accepted this. The hospital said because of his age, he has to be in a pediatric care unit, and he has to go in the night before, and you can't see him till the next morning. In other words, you can't stay all night with him because that's the way the procedure works. He would have the operation in the morning, but you couldn't spend the night with him that night. But I learned, because later when we were in France, and Mark had to have a appendicitis operation, appendectomy, I stayed with him all night long in the hospital and through the next night, and there wasn't any issue there. I mean, there's no way we would have, and they didn't even, the French, they wouldn't ever even think of a child staying by themselves. But I always remember that was such a weird situation, and that we allowed that to happen. Yeah. And then Jackie. Wow. I've had lots of things with you, Jack. But I think they were all good. You, as a baby, it's interesting. You didn't cry much, Mom. She didn't cry much. She was not a crybaby. You weren't at all a crybaby, honey. Did not. No. Well, and I remember with you going to St. John's with Sabrina and seeing you there when you graduated, and wishing you well. We were all going to Little Rock once to do a thing called Hands Across America. We were in Little Rock, but at that time there was this chain of hands that was supposed to stretch across America, and I can't remember exactly what the occasion was, why people were doing it. It had something to do with world hunger or whatever. And Jackie took a camera and went and interviewed people on the line. We were all standing out there on the line, and Jackie was doing a terrific job interviewing. And I remember she asked one person, she said, "If we're all holding hands here and lightning strikes in New Jersey, will you feel a tingle here in Little Rock, Arkansas?" And the funny thing is, some of those people really gave serious thought to it. The other thing I remember particularly about Jackie is that several people thought in our family, particularly Uncle Paul, that Jackie was just going to be the greatest thing on earth. They really have a terrific opinion. My whole family does of you. Now, as regards the grandchildren, the one thing I remember most about all 3 of them is reading to them. They loved to be read to. I remember with Jillian, it seemed to be Goodnight Moon. Is that the book? And Bonnie and Mark over on Burn Place, I would allow me to read to Jillian. And in reading to her, I mean, she was a little baby, she was in the crib, but still, I had the feeling she was following it, not the words so much, but just the whole process. And if you stopped, then she would kind of open her eyes. So what you had to learn to do was just pause, and then maybe start again, and then pause, longer and longer pause until she left. And with Lauren and Allison, it was the same process, just reading to them. And what you noticed was that if you read something to them and you missed a word, when you came back through and you didn't do it exactly the right way, they would catch it immediately. Particularly Allison with Mulan. She knew every word in that thing before she could read, and she wouldn't let you get away with anything. With Lauren, it was sort of a whole hodgepodge of books. She liked to have anything read to her. Allison was sort of particular with Mulan. She wanted that book, and I guess until she learned to read herself, she was still stuck on Mulan. But I enjoyed it, reading it to them. It was really a lot of fun. Yeah. Well, of course, we were very impressed by her from the minute we met her. She was very level-headed and very, very intelligent, and made a really good impression on us. Her parents did too. We loved being with them. We were just so pleased that Mark chose her and that she chose Mark. And as far as I can see, it's just been amazing. It's worked out so well. Yeah. Well, of course, we saw Gary through Kathy's eyes, and Gary was extremely likable. You know, he has that quality, very, very likable. And we, as Kathy grew to love him, of course we did too. I mean, just that's the way we saw him. But we always liked him. You know, I won't make comparisons, but we did like him. I liked to talk to him. Mm-hmm. He's a very hard-working young man, and I think he's fine. I liked Chris immediately. I thought he was a really good person. Maybe a little bit too handsome, but still. I thought he was a person that shared our feelings about family. Yeah. Feelings about family are very important to me, and I was very impressed that Chris seemed to have the same interest and desire for a close family. That was very important to me. My mom, your grandmother, as you know, had a deep faith, and I think that we shared it. I certainly shared her faith. It may not be as deep or as robust as hers, but I certainly do share it. My father worked so hard to support the family. It was only in later life that he also came to share our faith. He was not religious for much of my life, but then later he was. And I think that it sustained him in some tough times, because can you imagine the responsibility he had? I mean, just think about it sometimes. I read somewhere in a newspaper the other day about a woman who was the breadwinner of her family, and her husband had become the house mother, if you will, house father, and he was taking care of the kids and taking care of the laundry, taking care of everything, working hard, very hard. And she said, I know he works hard because I know what that job is. He said, but I had never realized how much pressure there is on me now, the woman, that I have to bring home that money to make sure that the family can make it. And she said, it's an awesome responsibility. And she said the guy she was talking to said, listen, if you think I'm going to be sympathetic to that, men have been doing this for 300 or 400 years. I said, that's exactly what they have to do. And I was thinking about my father when I read that. That was not an easy task. He didn't have all of the opportunities that we have today. He didn't have, the university training that would open doors to him. He did what he did. He had the ability, skills, but he had to apply them every day, and he had to find ways, and he did find ways. my beliefs, which, you know, couldn't be scientifically proven or anything near it. In fact, I'm very aware of scientific viewpoints on the subject of faith. But to me, faith is something very real, and it derives from my own experience in life. It derives from my trust in God and what I believe He's done to help me in times of need. And I think that's where faith comes from. It comes from your own experience. It's not something that you can, certainly you can't prove it, and you can challenge it on the basis of all sorts of scientific arguments, but still, to me, it's real. And I think that's very, very important in life. And it's in times when I have drifted away and not focused on that I've been the most unhappy. In the business world, you have to remember that I was educated as an engineer in a very scientific field. And I had confidence in that field. I had confidence in the abilities, but I had no idea whether I could manage people. I had no idea. I didn't have any feeling for it. In fact, you may not know this, but perhaps you do know it. Our family doesn't project a lot of self-confidence. We're more, I think most of us have to have things proven to us that things are going to go well. Mom always says, you're a big pessimist. I'm waiting to have things proven to me before I leap off and take, that things are going to turn out well. I'd like to see some evidence it's going to happen. But when I was with Mobile, after Reardon, and this may have been one of the reasons Reardon assigned me to London and gave me that chance. Mobile had a program in Bergenstock, Switzerland, where they sent higher management potential candidates. And they sent me one year to Bergenstock. And it was I think a 3-week program. Well, I had met people that reported to me, but it was a modest operation. And there, they gave us they weren't games, but they were, and I had no idea that they were designed this way, and nor did I have an idea that they were videotaping it, and they were. And it was a situation where teams were divided up, and on a team, you would have various people on the team would have a certain amount of information. That was all the information they had. They had this information. And they had to tell the truth, but that's all they had. If you got it all together, you could solve the problem, but you had to get it together. And it had to go together in a certain way. And I don't know why, but I could see immediately how it had to go together. And we went through this exercise and got to the solution in about 10 seconds. And several of the teams, never got there. And it was just a fluke. But you could see that if you asked the right questions, if you could ask this or you could ask that, you could get it together. Evidently, that was something that they were very impressed by, and I think they talked to Reardon about it, and that's why he sent me to London. I'm pretty sure that was kind of an aha. I had no idea that if you could put these things together in the right way, everybody could do their job and could do it better and could get the job done. I mean, they had a lot of other things like that, build an Eiffel Tower together and how you do that, but this was the one thing that I had no idea about. I had no concept that this was something that had merit or could mean something, but it does. In business, it does mean something. If you can pull on different people and put things together, that's how people work.
Part of your skill set.
Yeah, it just happened to be, and I didn't know it. That was a moment for me. Well, I've certainly made a lot of mistakes, and I find that when I look back, probably the area in business or any other area in the academic field, because I've had a lot of trouble with my research, it's whenever I've taken the easy course. That's always, for me, been the wrong thing. if there are two choices and one is easy but the other is probably more fundamental, I feel you got to go with the more fundamental. When I was growing up, because school was easy, taking that easy approach and not digging in, that was a mistake. And I find that that's true in life. To me, the most important thing for me is our family, and the way that Mom has contributed to developing our family and whatever I've contributed. To me, that's the most important thing that we have accomplished. It's not the money. It's not anything else. It's that. It's the family. Now, if you have a lot of trouble in the other areas, it can cause problems with the family. Fortunately, we haven't had that trouble, but to me, the success is the family, and I think each member of our family has just turned out well. I'm very proud of them. Mom doesn't think about herself. She doesn't think about herself. You all know that. And throughout my life, I have thought about myself. I've primarily thought, how do I get ahead? How do I do this? How do I do that? And that's wrong. Mom has taught me over the years that thinking about others is really the right thing to do. And if you think of Mom, that's exactly, she thinks primarily about other people first. And if you look at people who are the kind of people you really want to know or want to be, it's that kind of person. Really. Now, she gets into trouble that way because she can't say no many times when people are in need, and so then she ends up on the short stick as far as getting done what she has to do. But it's that price is well worth paying, I think. I think the good decisions were to try not to be in a niche, to try and get into things that were broader, to try not to have things closed in on me. Just if I'd stayed in the computer field, I think I would have been very unhappy. To try and make sure that you're in something that doesn't close you in. You can't always do that, but where I have been able to do it, I'm happy I did. Well, I would hope that I'm a better person as I approach 75 than I was as I approached 50. I would hope that with Mom's influence and God's, that I will become a better person, more oriented towards others and helping others, and trying to do things for other people. After you get to retirement age, you have an ability to do that if you choose to do it. You don't have to go out and play golf every day. Some people retire and don't do anything for others, but they're not married to Mom. Avoid the easy way. Try and avoid it, because I think it can lead to trouble. Don't look just at the moment, and don't look just at yourself. Look at others, just like Mom does. I think that's very, very important.